This is the biggest mistake Formula One didn't want you to see. 3 races. That's all it took for $1 billion regulation to start collapsing. We're talking about a 49% drop in audience. Drivers calling the cars unpredictable. Some even saying they're dangerous. And now, a secret update to the 2026 rules has been exposed. Not announced. Not explained. Leaked. Because behind closed doors, the FIA is already changing the rules. Reducing power. Altering energy systems. Trying to fix a problem that's getting worse every race. But here's the part that changes everything. These aren't upgrades. This is damage control. Because right now, cars can lose half their power in a fraction of a second. On a straight. At full speed. Creating speed differences that should not exist in Formula One. And after one incident, the drivers didn't stay quiet. They pushed back. Together. And when the entire grid pushes back, the FIA has no choice but to react. Fast. Which means this isn't just a rule change. It's a turning point. For the championship. For the future of the sport. And for who really controls Formula One. Subscribe now? Because what forced the FIA to secretly change the rules is something far bigger than anyone expected. At first, no one called it a failure. Because on the outside, everything still looked normal. Cars on track. Crowds in the stands. Lights out. Race on. But underneath that surface, something wasn't working. Not perfectly. Not cleanly. And definitely not the way it was promised. Because these cars were supposed to be faster. More efficient. More advanced than anything Formula One had ever seen. That was the vision. That was the selling point. But the reality was very different. Lap times were slower than the previous year. Not by a huge margin. But enough to raise concern. Enough for engineers to start digging deeper. Because when Formula One builds something new, it doesn't expect to go backwards. And yet, that's exactly what was happening. But speed wasn't the real issue. That was just the symptom. The real problem was how the performance behaved. Because for the first time, these cars were not delivering power consistently. They were cycling, charging, deploying, losing, recovering, constantly. And that created something no one fully anticipated. Moments where the car felt unstoppable, followed immediately by moments where it felt exposed. And the transition between those moments was brutal. Not gradual. Not predictable. Instant. Half the power gone in a fraction of a second. And that's where everything starts to unravel. Because Formula One is built on precision. Drivers push to the limit. Because they trust what the car will do. Every input. Every reaction. Every correction. It's all based on confidence. But now, that confidence was gone. Because the car could change behavior without warning. And when that happens, drivers don't push. They hesitate. They second guess. They adapt. And that's when racing starts to change. Not visually at first, but fundamentally. Because instead of attacking, drivers begin managing. Instead of fighting, they begin calculating. And that shift is something fans feel immediately. Even if they don't understand the technical reason. They just know something is missing. Something doesn't feel right. But here's where it escalates. Because this wasn't affecting every team the same way. Some teams adapted faster. They understood the energy cycles better. They controlled the system more efficiently. Others struggled. And that created a gap. Not just in performance, but in behavior. Which means on the same straight, you could have completely different realities. One car pushing at full power. Another conserving. Another about to lose everything. That difference should not exist. Not at this level. And once drivers realized that, everything changed. Because now, this wasn't just difficult. It was unpredictable. And unpredictability, in Formula One, is where risk begins. And that's the detail that started connecting everything. The performance issues. The strange racing. The drop in audience. The growing frustration. All pointing to the same place. A system that wasn't stable. And once that realization spread through the grid, the tone shifted. From patience to pressure. Because at that point, waiting was no longer an option. And what happened next is what forced the FIA into a decision. They were never supposed to make this early. And this is where everything shifts. Because up to this point, the drivers were adapting, managing the problem, working around it. But then, they stopped. Because once they understood what was really happening, they realized something much bigger. This wasn't a phase. This wasn't something that would naturally improve. This was built into the system itself. And that changes everything. Because in Formula One, Drivers accept difficulty. They accept risk. What they don't accept is losing control to something they can't predict. And that's exactly what this system was doing. Not just limiting performance, but deciding it. Deciding when the car could attack, when it had to defend, when it would suddenly lose power. And that's a line Formula One had never crossed before. Because this sport has always been about the driver, controlling the machine, not negotiating with it. But now, that balance was shifting. Quietly, but dramatically. And that's what triggered the turning point. Because behind the scenes, drivers started talking. Not to the media, to each other. Comparing experiences, connecting patterns, realizing this wasn't isolated. It was universal. Every team, every car, every driver, facing the same core issue. And once that understanding spread, the tone changed completely. This wasn't feedback anymore. This was pressure, collective pressure. Because when one driver speaks, it's an opinion. When all of them align, it becomes a force. And that force reached the FIA. Fast. Because now the message was clear. This isn't sustainable. Not for performance. Not for safety. Not for the sport. And that's when the situation escalated internally. Emergency meetings. Technical discussions moved forward. Manufacturers pulled into urgent conversations. Teams forced to share data they would normally protect. Because suddenly, this wasn't about gaining an advantage. It was about preventing a bigger problem. But here's where it becomes even more critical. Because the FIA wasn't just reacting to drivers. They were reacting to something else at the same time. Something even harder to control. The audience. Because while all of this was happening on track, fans were already disconnecting. Numbers dropping. Engagement falling. Interest fading faster than anyone expected. And that combination? Internal pressure from drivers, external pressure from fans, created something Formula One rarely experiences. Urgency. Real urgency. Because now the FIA wasn't working on long-term improvements. They were trying to contain a crisis. Before Miami. Before the next race made everything worse. And that's why what happened next is so unusual. Because Formula One does not change rules like this. Not this fast. Not under this kind of pressure. But this time, they had no choice. Because what they were about to face was bigger than performance. Bigger than competition. It was about control. And whether they still had it. And this is where the FIA makes its move. Not publicly. Not with a big announcement. But quietly, decisively, and under pressure. Because what leaked before Miami is not a simple adjustment. It's an emergency response. The first change targets the core of the problem. Electric deployment. Right now, cars can unleash massive electric power on the straights. Up to levels that create huge speed differences between drivers. So the FIA is cutting it. Reducing the maximum deployment. Lowering the peak. And that immediately changes everything. Because if the peak is lower, the drop is less violent. The difference between full power and no power becomes smaller. Which means fewer dangerous situations. Fewer unpredictable moments. But at the same time, it removes something else. Performance. Because those bursts of power are where overtakes happen. Where drivers attack. Where races come alive. So by fixing one problem, they risk creating another. And it doesn't stop there. Because the second change moves in the opposite direction. Increasing energy recovery. Allowing the battery to recharge faster. Which sounds simple. But it completely changes how the car behaves. Because now, drivers spend less time in that critical zone. That moment where the battery is empty, and the car becomes vulnerable. Instead, the system stabilizes. More consistent. More predictable. Exactly what drivers asked for. But again, there's a trade-off. Because faster recovery means different strategy. Different timing. Different racing. Everything shifts. And then comes the most controversial adjustment. Reducing the total energy allowed per lap. Less energy overall. Less extreme deployment. Less extreme depletion. Everything becomes more controlled. More balanced. But also, less aggressive. And that's where the identity of the sport comes into question. Because Formula One has always lived at the edge. Full attack. Maximum performance. No holding back. But now, drivers are being pushed toward management. Toward calculation. Toward control. And that changes the feeling of the sport completely. But here's the moment that reveals how serious this really is. A visual warning system. A light on the rear of the car. That activates when the car is about to lose power. Think about that. Formula One. Needing to warn drivers that another car might suddenly slow down. That has never been part of this sport. And yet now, it's necessary. Because without it, drivers are guessing. And at these speeds, guessing is dangerous. But even with all these changes, there are limits. Things the FIA cannot touch. They cannot change the 50% electric balance. They cannot bring back the systems they removed. They cannot undo the foundation of this era. Because doing that would mean admitting something much bigger, that the entire concept was flawed. So instead, they adjust around the problem, trying to stabilize it, trying to contain it, trying to make it work, without breaking everything else. But here's the real question. The one everything is building toward. What if this isn't enough? Because if these changes fail, this doesn't stay a technical issue. It becomes a crisis of direction, of identity, of what Formula One is supposed to be. And that's why Miami matters more than any race so far. Because this is not just a race. It's a test of the rules, of the system, of the decisions made under pressure. Because when the lights go out, there is no simulation, no theory, no second chance, only reality. And that reality will decide whether the FIA fixed the problem, or whether this revolt was just the beginning of something much bigger. And this is where everything becomes irreversible. Because once these changes hit the track, there is no going back to what this was supposed to be. Not immediately. Not cleanly. Because what Miami will reveal is not just whether the fixes work. It will reveal whether the foundation itself can hold. Because think about what's happening. The FIA is not introducing a new concept. They are correcting one. In real time. Under pressure. With drivers watching. Teams adapting. And fans already losing interest. That combination is something Formula One almost never faces. Because this sport is built on certainty, on stability, on rules that last long enough for teams to understand them, master them, exploit them. But now, that stability is gone. Because when rules start changing this early, everything becomes temporary. Setups, strategies, even advantages. Nothing feels secure. And that creates a completely different environment. Teams stop thinking long term. They start reacting, race by race, adjustment by adjustment, trying to stay ahead of a system that is still evolving. And that's dangerous. Not just technically, structurally. Because Formula One without stability loses one of its core strengths. Clarity. Knowing what the sport is. Knowing how it works. Knowing what defines performance. But right now, those lines are blurred. Because performance is no longer just about speed. It's about energy behavior. Software decisions. Moments the driver doesn't fully control. And when that happens, the identity of the sport begins to shift. Quietly, but significantly. From pure racing to managed systems. From instinct to calculation. And that's where the real conflict appears. Because for some, this is progress. More efficient. More advanced. More aligned with the future of technology. But for others, this is something else. A loss. Of rawness. Of unpredictability in the right way. Of that feeling that anything can happen, because a driver pushed beyond the limit. Not because a system decided it. And Miami is where those two visions collide. Because if the changes bring back control, if drivers can push again, if the racing feels natural, then maybe this era survives. Maybe it stabilizes. Maybe everything we've seen becomes just a difficult beginning. But if it doesn't, if the cars still feel artificial, if the racing still feels managed, if the connection with fans keeps fading, then the conversation changes completely. Because then, this is not a temporary crisis. It's a direction problem. And direction problems are much harder to fix. Because they force a deeper question. Not how to adjust the rules, but whether the rules themselves should exist in this form at all. And that's the moment Formula One wants to avoid. Because once that question becomes public, everything is at risk. Manufacturers, investments, the credibility of the governing body, even the future of the sport. So when the lights go out in Miami, you're not just watching another race. You're watching a verdict. A moment that will quietly decide whether this new era can still be saved, or whether the revolt we're seeing now was just the first warning of something much bigger. Something that could redefine Formula One far beyond this season.